Arrest her! She murdered my son!
What? No! Vivian, I didn't! Adrian! Please! Let me say goodbye!
43 days later, the only other man who had been poisoned finally opened his eyes.
Johnson? Oh my God! Johnson, can you hear me?
Adrian. Where's Adrian?
He didn't make it.
Johnson Mercer had been unconscious for 43 days. He had barely returned to the world when he learned that the man he'd called his best friend for more than 20 years was dead.
Joyce. Claire, where is Joyce?
She was arrested.
For what?
They think she poisoned both of you with Adrian's murder. Johnson, the police found evidence. They said the poison was in their house and—
No.
You've been unconscious for 6 weeks. You don't know what they found.
I know Joyce. She did not poison us.
The case against Joyce looked almost impossible to fight. Her husband was dead. Johnson had nearly died beside him, and every piece of evidence seemed to point directly at her.
Why are you here, Johnson?
Because you couldn't have done this.
Everyone thinks I killed him.
I don't, and I'm gonna prove it.
Johnson had no proof yet, only certainty. But once he began looking at the case as something built to condemn Joyce, rather than something that proved her guilt, the evidence started telling a very different story. Then Johnson found one detail that made him question everything they had been told about that night. Welcome to Tales Through Time, where love is tested, secrets are exposed, and even broken hearts can find their way home. Back in his hospital room after the prison visit, Johnson lay propped against the pillows with Rachel beside him, and the prosecution's files spread across the tray table. He was still weak enough that lifting a folder tired his arm, but he refused to stop reading. Rachel tapped the photograph of the dinner table. The prosecution says Joyce prepared the drinks before either of you collapsed. Johnson stared at the photograph. Something about it bothered him. Then he saw it. This wasn't my seat. Rachel leaned closer. What? Johnson pointed to another chair. I sat there when I arrived. A beat passed. Adrian made me move. Rachel's expression changed. Johnson looked down at the timeline beside the photograph. And I wasn't supposed to arrive that early. Who asked you to? Johnson's eyes settled on Adrian's photograph. Adrian. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. It proved nothing by itself. But it was the first detail in a case everyone considered solved that Joyce could not have arranged in advance. She had not known when Johnson would arrive. She had not chosen where he would sit. Adrian had. Johnson asked for everything after that. The prosecution's case against Joyce appeared almost insultingly neat. The dinner had taken place at the Vale residence. The substance responsible had been found in a cabinet accessible to her. Purchase records appeared to point back to her. Investigators had found evidence of tension in the marriage. And Adrian's will left her enough money to turn grief into a motive a jury could understand. But now Johnson stopped looking at those facts as separate proofs, and started asking who had arranged for them to fit together so perfectly. The prison visit had left him with one image he could not shake. Joyce behind reinforced glass in an orange jumpsuit, her face thinner than he remembered, asking why he had come. Get her out, he told Rachel. Rachel sighed. We're working on it. No, work faster. Johnson, she's charged with murder. Then give the court a reason to stop treating the prosecution's story like a fact. Within days, Johnson's statement about the seating arrangement and Adrian's request that he arrive early forced the timeline back under scrutiny. Within 2 weeks, questions about the purchase records emerged. Within 3, Rachel's team demonstrated that the online transaction linked to Joyce had originated from an unfamiliar device. By the 4th week after Johnson woke, a judge agreed that the case had changed enough to reconsider Joyce's detention. She came out shortly after sunset. There were reporters beyond the barriers. Johnson did not go. He wanted to. Instead, he waited inside a quiet apartment his company kept downtown, away from photographers and away from the Vale estate that Joyce refused to return to. When the door finally opened, Rachel entered first. Joyce followed. Johnson stood too quickly. His cane slipped. He caught the edge of the table. Joyce froze. For a moment, neither moved. The prison visit had been all cold metal, orange cloth, and a telephone receiver. This was the first time there was no glass between them. Johnson had imagined this moment more than once. He had imagined anger, tears, relief. He hadn't imagined how strange it would feel to see his best friend's wife standing 10 feet away while that friend was buried in a cemetery. Joyce looked at the cane. You shouldn't be standing. It was such an ordinary thing to say that Johnson nearly laughed. Instead, he sat. Joyce remained near the door. Then she asked the question he least expected. Did Adrian suffer? Johnson looked at her. Rachel lowered her eyes. Joyce swallowed. They won't tell me anything. His family won't speak to me. They arrested me at his burial, Johnson. I didn't even get to say goodbye. Her voice trembled for the first time. Did he suffer? Johnson had no memory beyond the moment he collapsed. He could have lied. He couldn't. I don't know. Joyce nodded. She pressed her lips together. I keep thinking his last thought must have been that I did it. No, she looked at him. He knew you didn't. You can't know that. Johnson held her gaze. I know Adrian. Something moved through Joyce's expression. Pain, perhaps, or resentment. You knew him better than I did, apparently. Johnson didn't answer. She turned away. Everyone says I poisoned my husband. His mother says I married him for his money. The papers say I wanted him dead before the trust transfer. You didn't. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Joyce finally turned back toward him. How can you be so certain? Johnson looked at her for a long moment. Because he had watched Joyce care for Adrian through illnesses nobody knew about. Because he had once seen her sit on a bathroom floor with him for 4 hours after Adrian suffered a panic attack before an important board meeting. Because when the Vale family had humiliated her, Joyce's answer had always been to leave before she became cruel in return. Because Johnson had loved her long enough to know what she was capable of, and what she wasn't. But he could say none of that, so he chose the part he could safely tell her. Because nothing I've ever seen in you looks like this. Joyce's expression shifted. Johnson continued. You can get angry, you can walk away, you can shut a door and never open it again. His eyes held hers, but you don't destroy people. The first real discovery came from Adrian's laptop. The Vale family had fought to keep it from Joyce's defense team, claiming it contained confidential corporate information. Rachel fought back. The court eventually allowed a restricted forensic review. They were looking for evidence about the inheritance. Instead, Joyce found Johnson. She was sitting with Rachel when the analyst pulled up years of archived messages between Adrian and his best friend. Most were ordinary, business, sports, insults. Only old friends could understand. Then Joyce saw her own name. Adrian. She's angry, Johnson. What did you do, Adrian? Why do you automatically assume I did something, Johnson? Because Joyce doesn't stay angry for sport. What did you do? Joyce smiled despite herself. Then the next messages appeared. Adrian. I canceled dinner, Johnson. Again? Adrian. Mom called a family meeting, Johnson. You canceled on your girlfriend for a meeting your mother invented 2 hours ago? Adrian. Don't start, Johnson. I'm not the one you should be worried about. There were hundreds. Joyce kept reading. Adrian. Roses or peonies? Johnson. Neither. Adrian. Very useful. Johnson. Lilies. Adrian. Why lilies? Johnson. Because she stopped outside that florist on Hanover for 5 minutes last Thursday, looking at the white ones. Joyce's fingers stopped over the keyboard. She remembered those lilies. Adrian had sent them to her office the next morning. She had kept one pressed between the pages of a book for years. Another message. Adrian. I need somewhere for Saturday, Johnson. Take her to Bellamy Pier. Adrian. That's not exactly Vale-level impressive. Johnson. That's the point. She doesn't care about impressive. She told you her dad used to take her to the waterfront when she was little. Listen when the woman talks. Joyce slowly leaned back. Bellamy Pier, their first anniversary. She had once told Adrian it was the night she realized she might marry him. Rachel glanced at her. Do you want to stop? No. She kept scrolling. The messages became more intimate after the engagement. Adrian. She thinks my family hates her. Johnson. They don't exactly hide it. Adrian. What am I supposed to do? Fight everybody? Johnson. If everybody is disrespecting the woman you're marrying, yes. Then, Adrian. Mom says bringing Joyce to Christmas will create unnecessary tension. Johnson. Then don't go. Adrian. It's Christmas, Johnson. Exactly. Joyce's eyes began to sting. She remembered that Christmas. Adrian had arrived at her apartment carrying 2 suitcases and told her he had chosen her. She had cried in his arms. She had thought it was the bravest thing he had ever done. Now she could see the message Johnson had sent 19 minutes before Adrian arrived. Johnson, you can't keep asking her to join your life while disappearing into theirs every time they snap their fingers. Joyce closed her eyes. Why didn't I know? Rachel didn't answer. Joyce wasn't asking her. Johnson was furious when he learned what she had seen. Not at Joyce, at himself. There was no reason for her to read all of that. Rachel crossed her arms. We were searching Adrian's communications. You could have filtered. Johnson. He stopped. Rachel studied him. How long? He looked toward the window. Don't. How long were you in love with her? His jaw tightened. That has nothing to do with the case. I'm beginning to think it has everything to do with the case. Johnson turned. Why? Because Adrian mentioned you repeatedly in messages with his mother during the last 6 months of his life. That silenced him. Rachel placed several printed pages on the table. Most were bland. Family arguments, trust negotiations. Vivian complaining about Joyce. Then Johnson saw his surname. Mercer remains the complication. He read it twice. What does that mean? We don't know. Johnson sat. Rachel watched him carefully. Did Adrian know? Johnson didn't pretend not to understand. Yes. How? I told him. Rachel's eyebrows rose. You told your best friend you were in love with his wife? No. Johnson's answer came sharply. I told him before she was his wife. Joyce heard the rest from Johnson himself. She came to his apartment that evening carrying copies of the messages. She placed them on the table between them. I want the truth. Johnson looked at the papers. You already have it. No, I have fragments. Joyce. Did you love me? He looked up. She corrected herself. Back then. Silence. Johnson leaned against the back of his chair. Yes. Joyce stared at him. Before Adrian and I got together? Yes. Did he know? Yes. She seemed almost offended by the answer. How did he know something about me that I didn't? Johnson exhaled slowly. Because there was nothing for you to know. You loved me. That didn't make you responsible for it. She fell silent. Johnson looked away. When we met you, Adrian and I were both interested. I realized pretty quickly that when you walked into a room, you looked for him. Joyce's expression softened. So you stepped aside. You make that sound heroic, wasn't it? No. He smiled without humor. It was miserable. Despite everything, Joyce almost smiled. Johnson continued. But you loved him. And he loved you. That made the decision simple. Then why did you keep helping him? That question hurt more. Johnson looked at her. Because he was my friend. Even when helping him meant helping him keep me? Yes. Joyce shook her head. I don't understand that. You weren't something to win, Joyce. The room went very quiet. You chose him. Once you did, there was nothing honorable about standing somewhere waiting for his marriage to fail. Joyce looked down. Johnson's voice softened. I wanted him to be good to you. And all those things. She touched the messages. The flowers, Bellamy Pier, Christmas. Adrian made his own choices. With your instructions. He asked for advice. Constantly. Johnson said nothing. Joyce's eyes filled. I don't know what belongs to my marriage anymore. He leaned forward. Don't do that. She looked at him. Don't rewrite every good thing because you're angry. How am I supposed not to? Because Adrian did love you. She gave a broken laugh. You're defending him. He was my best friend. He let me sit in jail for killing him. Johnson stopped. The sentence hung between them. Neither of them had meant to say it that way. Joyce slowly frowned. Johnson did too. He repeated it quietly. He let you sit in jail for killing him. Joyce's face changed. What? Johnson stood. His cane struck the floor. Nothing. No? You just? I need to see Adrian's medical records. The records were incomplete. That was the second crack. Adrian had supposedly died at 2:13 the morning after the poisoning. The physician who certified the death was Dr. Malcolm Price, who had treated members of the Vale family for nearly 30 years. No independent post-mortem had been performed. Adrian Vale had objected on religious and family grounds. The body had been released unusually quickly. The funeral had been closed. Casket. Johnson stared at the records while Rachel spoke. There are legitimate explanations for all of this. Name one. Powerful family, private physician, expedited arrangements. He was 34 years old and died from suspected poisoning while his wife was under investigation. I know, and nobody performed an independent autopsy. I know, Johnson looked at the toxicology report. What did they find in his blood? Rachel hesitated. Enough to support poisoning. That's not what I asked. She understood. Substantially less than what was found in yours. Johnson slowly raised his eyes. How much less? Rachel told him. He became very still. Joyce was sitting across the room. She whispered. Could he have survived? Rachel answered carefully. Possibly. Johnson stood. This time he didn't reach for the cane. Joyce watched him struggle upright. What are you thinking? Johnson looked at the death certificate. I think we have been investigating the wrong murder. The case turned uglier from there. A deleted folder recovered from Adrian's personal cloud contained drafts of communications between him and Vivian. They weren't explicit. People planning terrible things rarely wrote them plainly. But the pattern was unmistakable. The Vale family trust, worth hundreds of millions, was due to transfer controlling authority to Adrian on his 35th birthday. For years, Vivian had fought conditions written by Adrian's grandfather that reduced her control once Adrian assumed leadership. Adrian had wanted the inheritance. Vivian wanted influence over the man receiving it. Joyce stood between them. One message read, Your position regarding the marriage must be resolved before final distribution. Another, she will have claims on everything once the transfer is complete. Then Adrian. I said I would handle Joyce, Vivian, and Mercer. No response appeared beneath it. 3 days later, Mercer remains the complication. Johnson stared at the screen. He knew exactly what it meant now. Joyce didn't. Not yet. What complication? Johnson's eyes remained on the words. Me. Why? He didn't answer. Rachel pulled up another recovered file, an audio recording. It had apparently been captured unintentionally by Adrian's phone during a private conversation in his studies several weeks before the poisoning. Adrian's voice came first. You think I don't see it? Johnson's younger voice answered. See what? The way you look at her. There was silence. Then Johnson. Don't do this. Adrian laughed bitterly. You've spent 6 years showing me how to keep my own wife happy. You asked me for advice. You remember everything about her. So should you. Joyce closed her eyes. The recording continued. Adrian's voice hardened. Sometimes I wonder whether she would have chosen you if you'd actually tried. Johnson replied immediately. She chose you. You didn't answer. I don't need to. Maybe you've just been waiting. A chair scraped. Johnson's voice changed. You listened to me very carefully. I gave you the woman I loved because she loved you. I stood beside you at your wedding. I helped you fix things when you hurt her. I defended your marriage even when I thought you were being an idiot. Don't insult me by pretending I've spent 6 years waiting for your life to collapse so I could pick through what was left. Nothing followed for several seconds. Then Adrian said quietly, Maybe that's what bothers me. The recording ended. Joyce opened her eyes. What did he mean? Johnson already knew. He wished he didn't. He resented me. For loving me? For knowing you. Joyce shook her head. No. Joyce. No. Adrian wasn't. He was jealous. Of what? Johnson looked at the messages scattered across the table. And Joyce followed his eyes. Her face broke. Not dramatically. No scream. No sudden tears. Just a terrible understanding settling into place. The things I loved about him. Johnson said nothing. Joyce whispered. He thought they were yours. He was wrong. Was he? Johnson turned away. He married you. He chose to follow advice. He chose to stand up for you when he did. Those were still his decisions. But when he stopped listening to you, Johnson closed his eyes. Joyce finished for him. He chose his family. The truth about the inheritance came next. The transfer had not been scheduled for the morning after the poisoning, as the press had reported. The ceremony was. Legally, the transfer had become irrevocable at 5 o'clock the previous evening. 3 hours before dinner. Adrian already controlled the trust when Johnson arrived at the house. The public event planned for the next morning had merely been theater. That changed everything. Adrian no longer needed to survive publicly. He only needed the world to believe he had survived long enough to inherit. Then his estate could be manipulated through arrangements created beforehand. Rachel's investigators discovered a private holding company established 11 days before the poisoning. A significant amount of money had moved through it after Adrian's death. One payment went to Dr. Malcolm Price. Another went to a private medical care company in Vermont. Johnson stared at the name. Find out who they were treating. Rachel nodded. They won't release patient records. Then find another way. Johnson, legally, she smiled faintly. I assumed. Joyce was standing near the window. Suppose you're right. Johnson looked at her. She struggled to say the next words. Suppose Adrian planned this. Neither of them moved. Why would he poison himself? To make the story believable. And you, Johnson's jaw tightened. Joyce understood before he spoke. No? He knew. No. He knew I would never believe you did it. You don't know that? He said it himself. Mercer remains the complication. Joyce came toward him. Maybe that meant something else. Like what? I don't know, her voice cracked. Johnson went quiet. Joyce pressed both hands over her face. My husband cannot have tried to kill you because you loved me. Johnson stepped toward her and stopped himself before touching her. She lowered her hands. He was your brother. I know. You're standing here saying he tried to kill you like it doesn't matter. It matters. Then why aren't you angry? Johnson looked at her. I'm so angry I don't know what to do with it. His voice was quiet. That made it worse. I lost 43 days of my life. My sister was told I might never wake up. I can't climb stairs without feeling like my lungs are burning. And if we're right, the person who did that was the man I would have trusted with everything I owned. He looked toward Adrian's photograph on the table. But none of that is the part I can't get past. Joyce's eyes lifted. Johnson met them. He knew what they would do to you. She didn't move. He knew they would put you in a cell. He knew you would believe he was dead. He knew you would grieve him while everyone called you his murderer. Johnson's face hardened. And he chose it anyway. Joyce turned away before the tears came. Johnson stood behind her, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough not to presume he had the right. After a while, she whispered, Find him. Johnson answered, I will. They found Malcolm Price before they found Adrian. Not in a hospital, not in his office. At his home, shortly before dawn, with 2 suitcases beside the front door. By the time Johnson arrived, federal investigators were already inside. Rachel met him on the driveway. You shouldn't be here. Johnson looked past her toward the house. He signed my best friend's death certificate. And you're still recovering. So was Adrian, apparently. Rachel gave him a warning look. Johnson ignored it and walked inside. Malcolm Price was standing beside his dining table in shirt sleeves, watching an investigator remove documents from a leather travel bag. His passport lay on the table. Beside it was a boarding confirmation for Zurich. Price saw Johnson and went pale. You have no right to be here. Johnson stopped several feet away. Neither did Joyce have a right to spend nearly 2 months accused of murdering a man who wasn't dead. Price's jaw tightened. I don't know what you've been told. Good. Johnson glanced toward the suitcases. Then this should be easy. Price said nothing. Johnson moved closer. You treated the Vale family for 32 years. Price's eyes narrowed. Births, illnesses, surgeries. Probably more secrets than their lawyers. Price glanced toward the investigators. Johnson noticed. Was it worth it? What? Whatever they paid you. Price's face hardened. You don't understand that family. No, but I'm beginning to. Price turned away. Johnson continued. You signed a certificate saying Adrian Vale died at 2:13 in the morning. No response. You knew his wife was already becoming the obvious suspect. Price's hand tightened around the back of a chair. You knew she could be charged with murder. Still nothing. And you signed it anyway. Price finally looked at him. My responsibility was to my patient. Johnson became very still. Interesting choice of words. Price seemed to realize what he had said. Too late, Johnson took another step toward him. Dead men aren't patients. The room went silent. Price's face drained. Rachel looked sharply toward the federal investigator beside her. Johnson didn't take his eyes off the doctor. Where did they take him? Price shook his head. I can't. You can. You don't know what Vivian Vale is capable of. Johnson gave a humorless laugh. I spent 43 days unconscious because of what her son was capable of. Price looked down. Johnson's voice lowered. Joyce sat in a cell grieving a husband you knew was breathing. That reached him. Price's shoulders dropped slightly. I was told nobody would be hurt. Johnson stared at him. Look at me, Price did. Johnson leaned heavily against his cane. Do I look unharmed? Price swallowed. I didn't know what Adrian intended for you. But you knew what they intended for Joyce. Silence. Price slowly lowered himself into a chair. For the first time, he looked less like the Vale family's distinguished physician and more like an old man who had run out of places to hide. He regained consciousness shortly after midnight. Johnson didn't move. Rachel stopped writing. Price continued. He was weak, confused at first, but alive. Johnson's breathing changed. Who ordered you to declare him dead? Price hesitated. Vivian. Johnson's eyes hardened. And Adrian? Price closed his eyes. He agreed. For several seconds, Johnson said nothing. Somewhere behind him, an investigator shifted. Finally, how did they get him out? Through a restricted service corridor. A private ambulance came before dawn. The coffin? Price looked at the floor. I never saw what they placed inside it. Johnson turned away, then stopped. Where is Adrian? I don't know. Johnson looked back at him. Price raised both hands. That part is true. Once he left the hospital, they cut me out. Rachel stepped closer. Who handled his medical care afterward? Price hesitated, then gave them the name of a private medical company headquartered in Vermont. Johnson looked at Rachel. She already had her phone out. For the first time, the impossible no longer sounded impossible. Adrian Vale had not survived by accident. He had survived because he was never supposed to die. Price's confession gave investigators what they needed. Adrian's death certificate had been falsified, and Vivian's security team had removed him from the hospital before dawn. The coffin buried in the Vale family plot had never been independently identified. Joyce sat motionless while Rachel relayed the confession. Johnson didn't sit at all. Where is he? Price claims he doesn't know. He's lying. Probably. What about the Vermont company? They provided private nursing staff to a residence registered through a shell corporation. Johnson's expression changed. Where? Rachel told him. It was not Vermont. The company was headquartered there. The residence was in Connecticut. A Vale property that had supposedly been sold 9 years earlier. Johnson smiled for the first time in days. There was nothing pleasant in it. Found you. Vivian Vale chose the worst possible night to hold a memorial gala for her son. Or perhaps the best. The event had been planned for months. A glittering evening announcing the Adrian Vale Foundation, celebrating what Vivian described publicly as her son's legacy of integrity, family, and service. Hundreds attended. Business leaders, trustees, politicians, family friends. People who had spent weeks reading headlines that called Joyce calculating, ambitious, and murderous. Joyce almost refused to go. Johnson didn't try to persuade her. This isn't about embarrassing them, he said. Then why there? Because Vivian built the lie publicly. He adjusted the cuff of his black suit. She should hear the truth in the same room. Joyce looked at him. You've been waiting years to say something like that to his mother, haven't you? Johnson glanced at her. Possibly. For the first time in months, she laughed. Just once. Small, unexpected. Johnson looked away before she saw what hearing it did to him. They entered the ballroom together. Conversation died in waves. Heads turned first toward Johnson, then Joyce. Vivian Vale was standing beneath an enormous arrangement of white flowers beside a portrait of her supposedly dead son. Her face changed when she saw them. She crossed the room immediately. What is she doing here? Joyce stopped. It was almost funny. Years collapsed into one moment. Another gala. Another room full of powerful people. Another Adrian Vale deciding Joyce did not belong. Years earlier, during a discussion about Adrian's inheritance, Vivian had smiled across a private table and said, "Joyce, perhaps you might excuse us. This concerns the family." Joyce had begun to rise. Adrian had frozen, and Johnson had spoken before anybody else. "If Adrian is too shocked by what you just said to answer his own mother, I'm not." The entire table had gone silent. Joyce is his wife. If you're discussing his future, his inheritance, or the family she's expected to represent beside him, then she belongs in the room. Adrian had looked at Johnson, then at Joyce, and finally said, "Johnson's right, my wife stays." For years, Joyce had remembered Adrian's words. Only much later had she remembered who gave him the courage to say them. Now Vivian stood before them again. "She has no right to be here." Johnson looked at her. "We've had this conversation before." Vivian's face tightened. "This is my son's memorial." "No." Johnson's voice carried just far enough that nearby conversations stopped completely. "This is your son's cover story." Silence spread across the ballroom. Vivian lowered her voice. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know Adrian didn't die." Someone gasped. Then another. Vivian went pale. Johnson continued. "I know Dr. Price falsified the death certificate. I know money moved from Adrian's new holding company into accounts connected to Price and the people who hid him. I know the trust transferred before the poisoning. I know evidence was planted against Joyce." Vivian looked toward the doors. Too late. Investigators were already entering. Johnson stepped closer. "And I know your son is alive." For the first time in all the years Johnson had known her, Adrian Vale had nothing to say. Adrian was arrested 37 miles away. He had been staying in a secluded house under the name Adrian Vale. He had gained weight since leaving the hospital. His hair was longer. A faint scar marked one side of his neck. But he was alive. The photograph of him being escorted from the property went around the world before midnight. The murder charge against Joyce collapsed before sunrise. 2 days later, she asked to see Adrian. Johnson didn't understand why. He didn't try to stop her. The meeting took place through reinforced glass. Joyce picked up the phone. Adrian did the same. For several seconds, all she could do was look at him. Alive. The husband she had mourned. The man whose face she had seen every night when she closed her eyes inside a cell. Adrian spoke first. "Joyce." Her fingers tightened around the receiver. "You're alive." He swallowed. "I can explain." A strange smile crossed her face. "That's what you have?" "Things got out of control. You poisoned Johnson." Adrian looked away. "My mother." "No." Joyce's voice became firm. "You do not get to hide behind her now. I was trying to protect everything my grandfather built. You tried to kill your best friend." Adrian's face tightened. "You think this was about Johnson? You poisoned him. I was supposed to wake up." Joyce stared at him. Adrian held her gaze. He wasn't. For a moment, she seemed unable to understand what he had just admitted. Then she did. "You planned for Johnson to die." Adrian looked away. He would never have let it happen. "Let what happen?" "You going to prison." Joyce's expression changed. Adrian gave a bitter laugh. "Don't look surprised. You know him now, don't you?" "Don't." He would have torn apart every piece of evidence, every witness, every account. He would have kept digging until there was nothing left. Because he knew I was innocent. Because he loved you. Joyce went silent. Adrian leaned closer to the glass. "You think I didn't know what my marriage looked like from where I stood? What is that supposed to mean?" "It means I spent years wondering which parts of you were actually mine." Joyce stared at him. Adrian's voice grew rougher. "The flowers you loved?" Johnson remembered them. "The places you thought I chose because I understood you?" Johnson suggested them. "Every time my mother pushed you aside and I hesitated, he was there telling me what kind of man I should be." "That was still your choice. Was it?" "Yes." "No, Joyce. It was always him standing somewhere behind me." His eyes hardened. "And you loved me for it." Joyce recoiled slightly. Adrian continued. Do you know what that does to a man after 6 years? Knowing the woman sleeping beside him might have loved his best friend if that friend had simply stepped forward first. Johnson never did that to you. That made it worse. Joyce frowned. Adrian's voice dropped. He didn't have to compete. He could afford to be noble. He built his own company, his own name, his own money. Nobody controlled him. Nobody looked at him and saw somebody else's son. His hand pressed against the glass. I had one thing coming that was supposed to be mine. The inheritance. The Vale companies. The trust. Control. Money. No. His answer came sharply. Proof. Joyce stared at him. Proof of what? Adrian's face twisted with something deeper than greed. That I wasn't just Vivian Vale's obedient son. That I wasn't Johnson Mercer's weaker friend who happened to get the woman first. That there was one thing in my life nobody could look at and wonder whether I deserved it. Joyce's expression hardened. So you chose an inheritance over me. Adrian shook his head. I chose the one thing I thought nobody could take from me. And to keep it, you took everything from everyone else. He looked at her. You don't understand what I would have lost. Something inside Joyce finally became still. For weeks she had carried questions. Maybe his mother had forced him. Maybe fear had broken him. Maybe he had loved her but panicked. Maybe somewhere inside the man she married there was still something worth mourning. Now she understood. Adrian had not destroyed them because he was incapable of love. He had destroyed them because, when love demanded that he surrender control, pride, and possession, he chose possession. Adrian was still talking. The trust was hundreds of millions, Joyce. Control of the companies, the properties, everything my family spent generations building. If I walked away, I lost my husband. Adrian stopped. Joyce's eyes filled, but her voice didn't shake. I sat in a cell and grieved my husband. I'm standing right here. She looked at him, and finally said the thing that freed her. No. Adrian's face changed. Joyce held his gaze. The man I thought I married never existed. She put the phone down. Adrian began speaking again. She couldn't hear him. She stood and walked away. Justice was not immediate. It rarely was. But it came. The case against Joyce was formally dismissed. Her record was cleared. The Vale family physician pleaded guilty to charges connected to the falsified death and obstruction. Evidence showed Vivian had participated in the plan to remove Joyce and conceal Adrian after the poisoning, though Adrian himself had escalated the scheme against Johnson far beyond what some members of the family had initially understood. Adrian faced charges not only for framing Joyce, but for the deliberate attempt on Johnson's life. The trust became entangled in years of litigation. The Vale name, once associated with discretion and power, became synonymous with a scandal nobody in the family could buy their way out of. Johnson recovered slowly. He hated physical therapy. Joyce discovered this because she occasionally drove him there purely to enjoy his misery. You're enjoying this, he said one morning, immensely. You used to be compassionate. Prison changed me, he laughed. The joke surprised both of them. There were many moments like that afterward, little pieces of life returning without permission. But Johnson never asked Joyce for anything. He never mentioned the recording, never mentioned how long he had loved her, never behaved as though saving her meant she owed him a future. When Joyce moved into a small house she bought for herself, Johnson helped carry boxes. When she began working again, he sent no flowers. That made her smile. He had apparently decided flowers had become complicated. Months passed, then nearly a year. One evening, Joyce invited him to dinner. Not because she needed help, not because there was new evidence, not because a lawyer had called. Just dinner. They sat outside after sunset. Johnson talked about opening another office. Joyce pretended to be interested in commercial property until he accused her of yawning. Then the conversation faded into comfortable silence. Joyce looked at him. Why didn't you tell me? Johnson knew immediately. Because you were married. Before that, you were choosing Adrian. I hadn't chosen him yet. You were going to, she smiled faintly. So confident. You weren't subtle, Joyce laughed. Then her expression softened. I've been thinking about something. That usually worries me. She ignored him. When everything happened, I kept trying to separate the Adrian I loved from the Adrian who did those things. Johnson said nothing. I kept going back through our marriage trying to understand how somebody could change that much. She looked toward the garden. And every time I remembered something beautiful, I started wondering where it came from. Johnson's face tightened slightly. Joyce, the lilies. He looked down. Bellamy Pier. Those were Adrian's choices too. Christmas. Johnson was quiet. The gala. Still nothing. Joyce looked at him. All those years, I thought Adrian was the one teaching me that I could belong beside him. Her voice softened. But whenever he forgot how to love me, somehow you reminded him. Johnson finally met her eyes. That doesn't mean what you think it means. What do I think it means? That you married the wrong man. Joyce was silent for a moment. No. Johnson looked surprised. I married the man I chose with what I knew then. She moved a little closer. And I won't dishonor the woman I was by pretending she was stupid for loving him. Johnson's expression softened. But now I know more. He didn't move. Joyce smiled through the sudden shine in her eyes. I kept remembering all the reasons I fell in love with Adrian. Johnson swallowed. And one by one, she reached for his hand. I kept finding you. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Johnson Mercer had absolutely nothing useful to say. Joyce laughed. That's new. He looked at their joined hands, then at her. Joyce, if this is gratitude. It isn't. If it's because I helped you. It isn't. If you're still grieving. I am. That stopped him. Joyce squeezed his hand. I probably always will in some way. Not for the man Adrian became. For the life I thought I had. Johnson nodded. She continued. But grief doesn't get to choose the rest of my life. A long silence passed. Then Johnson asked the question he had refused to ask for nearly 8 years. What do you want? Joyce looked at him. Not Adrian, not the Vale family. Not the man who had once stood aside because he believed her choice mattered more than his desire. Johnson. This time, she knew exactly who she was choosing. You. And for once, Johnson didn't have to teach another man what to do. He leaned toward her, slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. She didn't. When he kissed her, there were no borrowed words, no borrowed gestures, no friend whispering instructions from somewhere behind the scenes. Only two people who had taken the longest possible road toward a truth that had been quietly waiting for them from the beginning. Years earlier, Johnson had loved Joyce enough to let her choose someone else. Then he had loved her enough to protect that marriage. Later, he loved her enough to believe her when the entire world did not. And in the end, perhaps that was the difference between the two men. Adrian had loved Joyce whenever loving her did not cost him too much. Johnson had loved her even when the price was never having her at all. And that was why, when Joyce finally chose again, she chose the man who had never needed to possess her in order to love her.